Nobody wants to look at you while they eat. You're bad for business, Maggie. Go hide in the back where the customers don't have to suffer through it." He said it loud. On purpose. In front of a packed room, a full staff, and 5 bikers who had just walked through the door. Maggie didn't cry. She didn't run. She gripped her order pad until her knuckles went white, and she walked straight toward those bikers anyway, expecting laughter. What she got instead stopped the entire restaurant cold. The largest man at the table slowly stood up, looked past her toward the owner, and said quietly, "Who did that to you? If this story hits something in you, subscribe, hit the bell, and drop your city in the comments. I want to see exactly how far Maggie's story travels." Maggie Carter had a system. That was the only way to survive a place like Rusty Wheel Café. You keep your eyes down. You keep moving. You don't let anything stick to you. Not the comments, not the looks, not the laughter that follows you from the kitchen to table 7 and back again. You carry your weight, all of it, every pound of it, and you do the work, and you go home, and you count your money, and you go to sleep, and you do it again tomorrow. That was the system. That was survival. Maggie had been running that system for 3 years, 2 months, and if you asked her on a bad night, 17 days. She knew exactly how long because she had a goal, and that goal had a price, and that price was $14,200. The cost of 1 year at the Culinary Arts program at Tulsa Community College. Not the fancy school, not the dream school. Just enough school to get her one real step away from Rusty Wheel and the man who owned it. She was at $9,847. She was close, closer than she'd ever been. And that number, that small handwritten number on the piece of notebook paper she kept folded inside a tin box under her mattress at home. That number was the only thing that had kept her from walking out the door on days when Cliff Mercer made her feel like nothing. Days like today. It had started as bad days usually did before the lunch rush even hit. Cliff had come in 20 minutes late smelling like cigarettes and bad decisions, and he'd gone straight for the coffee maker, which was Maggie's first warning sign. When Cliff went for coffee before he said a word to anyone, it meant his night had been rough, and when his nights were rough, someone at the cafe was going to pay for it. That someone was almost always Maggie. "You mopped these floors this morning," he said, not looking at her, pouring his cup. "Yes, sir. 6:30, same as always." "They look greasy." She looked down at the floors. They didn't look greasy. She had mopped them twice actually, once at 6:30 and once again at 7:15 when a trucker had tracked mud in from the parking lot. But she didn't say that. The system didn't allow for that. "I'll go over them again before the rush," she said. Cliff finally looked at her. It was the kind of look that took a person apart piece by piece, not with anger exactly, but with something colder than anger. Dismissal. Like he was looking at a piece of furniture that had started to annoy him. "Yeah," he said. "You do that." By 11 o'clock, the cafe had filled with its usual crowd: retirees, nursing decaf, a couple of highway workers, on break the Hendersons from the farm supply store, who came in every day and always ordered the same thing and always left a $1.50 tip, no matter what Maggie did. She worked the floor the way she always did. Efficiently. Quietly. Smiling when smiled at, invisible when she needed to be invisible. But today, invisibility was harder to maintain. Because today, Danny Chu, the 19-year-old busboy, who had been working at Rusty Wheel for exactly 6 weeks, had apparently decided that making Maggie the punchline of his jokes was funnier than doing his actual job. It started small, the way most cruelties do. "Maggie, you sure you can fit through that gap by table 3? He said loud enough for the Hendersons to hear. "Might want to turn sideways." A few people chuckled. Not the Hendersons, but a couple of the highway workers. Maggie kept walking, kept smiling. The system. But Danny wasn't done. 10 minutes later, when she passed him near the counter. "You eat any of today's special yet? Just checking how much to prep." More laughter. This time from the cook, a heavy-set man named Gerald, who should have known better, but usually didn't. Maggie put a ticket on the wheel and said nothing. She was good at saying nothing. She had been practicing for 3 years, 2 months, and 17 days. What she was less good at, what she had never quite mastered, no matter how hard she tried, was keeping her face completely still when Cliff joined in. Because when Cliff joined in, it wasn't a joke anymore. It was a verdict. And verdicts had a way of settling into your bones. It happened at 2:15, right as the lunch crowd was thinning out. Maggie had just finished clearing table 6 and was carrying a full tray of dirty dishes back toward the kitchen when her foot caught the edge of a floor mat that had been folding up at the corner for 2 weeks. 2 weeks. She had reported it. 2 weeks. Nothing had been done about it, and the tray lurched. She caught it. Barely. But she caught it. Not a single dish hit the floor. She stood there for a second, heart-hammering tray-balanced dishes intact. And Cliff, who had watched the whole thing from his spot by the register, started to slow clap. "Oh, nice save, Maggie. Look at that, everyone. She moves fast when she wants to." A few nervous laughs around the room. Maggie's face went hot. "That mat by table 6 needs to be replaced," she said. Her voice came out quieter than she intended. "I've left 2 notes about it. Maybe if you weren't so heavy, you wouldn't be catching edges," Cliff said. And this time he wasn't playing. There was no performance in it, no theater of a bad joke. It was just flat and mean and said out loud in front of 6 customers and 2 co-workers. "Bad for business, Maggie. A waitress that can barely keep upright." Silence. The real kind. The kind that lands. Danny looked away. Even Gerald in the kitchen window looked somewhere else. Maggie set the tray down on the nearest surface. She looked at Cliff for exactly 2 seconds, long enough to show she'd heard him, not long enough to show him how much it cost. And then she walked into the kitchen and stood at the back sink with the water running cold over her wrists until her face stopped burning. 12 more weeks, she told herself. 12 more weeks. $9,847. She could do 12 more weeks. What she couldn't have known standing at that sink was that 12 more weeks was already irrelevant. Because at 8:47 that Friday evening, 5 motorcycles pulled off Highway 75 and into the Rusty Wheel parking lot, and everything Maggie Carter thought she knew about how her life worked was about to be rearranged. She heard them before she saw them. The rumble of those engines cutting through the thin walls of the cafe, the way thunder cuts through a quiet house. Every conversation at every table dipped by 10 decibels. Heads turned toward the windows. "Bikers," said Danny from behind the counter with the kind of unearned confidence that 19-year-olds sometimes have before life teaches them differently. Gerald leaned out the kitchen window. "Big ones." They weren't wrong. The 5 men who came through the door were not small, and they were not trying to appear friendly. Leather cuts, ink running up their necks and down their forearms, boots that had covered serious road, and a presence, a collective gravity that made the air in the cafe feel different the moment they walked in. The room went that particular kind of quiet that isn't really quiet at all, but is more like everyone holding the same breath at the same time. The lead man, the one who came through first, the one the others gave a half-step's distance to without even seeming to think about it, was somewhere in his early 40s. Dark hair going gray at the temples, a beard that had been growing a long time, eyes that were light-colored and very still, the kind of eyes that didn't scan a room nervously but instead settled on things and stayed there measuring. He found a booth near the back. The others filed in around him, and 3 of them took the neighboring table, and the smallest one, which wasn't very small, pulled up a chair to bridge the gap. Cliff materialized from the back office the way he always did when something caught his attention. He stood at the end of the counter, looking at the bikers, looking at his staff. And then he did what he always did when he had an audience he wanted to perform for. He made someone else the performance. He turned toward the kitchen, found Maggie refilling a napkin dispenser, and raised his voice just high enough to make sure the words carried. "Go send the big waitress," he said, and he said it with a smirk she could hear even with her back turned. "Let's see how long before they laugh her right out the door." There it was. She heard the cook suppress a laugh. She heard Danny actually make a sound, a short, bright bark of amusement that he muffled with his hand, but not quite in time. And she felt very distinctly the specific texture of being made small in front of strangers. She picked up her order pad. She straightened her apron. She walked out of the kitchen. Bog. The distance from the kitchen door to the biker's table was maybe 30 feet. She had walked it 1,000 times. But those 30 feet on that particular night with Cliff's laughter, still sitting in her chest like a stone, felt like something else entirely. She kept her eyes on the table, not on the floor. She had learned that looking at the floor made it worse, made her look exactly like what people already assumed she was. She kept her eyes level and her pace steady, and she told herself what she always told herself in these moments. Just the table. Just the order. Just the next 20 minutes. She stopped at the edge of their booth. "Evening," she said. "Welcome to Rusty Wheel. Can I start you all with something to drink?" The one with the still light-colored eyes looked up at her, and he didn't smirk. He didn't look past her, or through her, or down at her, in any of the dozen ways she'd been looked at in this uniform, in this building, over the past 3 years. He just looked at her directly, simply the way a person looks at another person, and said, "Coffee, please, all of us, if that's all right." "Of course," she said. She wrote it down. She turned to leave. "Hey." His voice was low, not commanding exactly, just significant, like a word said in a quiet room. She turned back. He was still watching her with those calm, measuring eyes, and there was something in his expression that she couldn't immediately categorize. Not pity, not curiosity. Something slower and more serious than either of those things. "What's good here?" he asked. It was such an ordinary question, such a completely ordinary thing to say in a diner at 8:50 on a Friday night. But it was the way he asked it, not as a test, not as a setup for something cruel, just as a genuine question from someone who actually wanted to know, that made something shift slightly behind her ribs. "Beef stew," she said before she could second-guess herself. "I know it doesn't look like much on the menu, but it's good. It's been going since this morning, and by now it's—" She paused, and something rare happened. She almost smiled. "It's ready." He nodded slowly. "We'll take 5. She wrote it down. She walked back to the kitchen, and she didn't hear any laughter following her this time. She came back with the coffee in less than 4 minutes. She'd timed herself, once knew exactly how long the walk took at her pace, had quietly adjusted her route so she could do it in under 5 even on a busy night. She set the cups down without incident. She started to leave. "You make the stew yourself?" one of the others asked a broader man with a red beard and a tattoo that climbed from his wrist to his collar. His voice was less careful than the first man's, but not unkind. "I help prep it," she said. "The recipe's mine, though, more or less." "More or less," he repeated, and he smiled like something about that struck him as honest in a way he appreciated. She didn't know what to do with that, so she just nodded and went back to work. She watched them from the edges of her attention, the way she'd learned to watch any table. Not staring, just aware. They were quiet mostly. They talked among themselves in voices low enough that she couldn't make out the words from the counter. The one with the light eyes didn't talk much at all. He drank his coffee slowly, and when he wasn't drinking it, he was watching. The room, the other staff. Cliff, who had returned to the back office, but whose loud phone voice carried through the walls. When she brought the stew, she set each bowl down without the small ceremony she sometimes gave it, the quiet mention of what was in it, the suggestion to taste it, before adding salt, the small pride she took in having had a hand in making it. She just set it down and stepped back. But the first man, the one with the still eyes, picked up his spoon and tasted it slowly and looked up at her and said, "This is the real thing." She blinked. "Excuse me? This stew, it's the real thing. Somebody put time into this." She stood there for a moment, not sure what to say, because nobody had said anything like that to her, at this job, in longer than she could remember. "Thank you," she finally managed. "I'm glad you like it." "What's your name?" "Maggie." Maggie. He said it like he was filing it away somewhere careful. I'm Cole. She nodded. She went back to work. But something had changed, and she couldn't have said exactly what it was, only that when she passed the kitchen a minute later and Danny started to say something in that particular tone he'd been practicing lately, she didn't feel the usual brace for impact. She felt something else, something quieter, something that didn't have a word for it yet. 2. The trouble started at 9:40. The cafe had emptied out to almost no one. A couple in the far corner, finishing pie, a trucker at the counter with a newspaper, and the 5 bikers who'd been nursing their second coffees for the better part of an hour. Maggie was running the floor alone because Danny had been sent home early. Cliff's moods cycled faster at the end of a long day, and Gerald was in the kitchen doing close-down prep. She was moving efficiently, refilling the trucker's coffee, wiping down the counter, setting up the side station for tomorrow morning. She didn't see Cliff come out of the back. She heard him before she saw him, the particular rhythm of his footsteps that she had learned to read like weather. Slow and deliberate meant he was on the phone or distracted. Quick and heavy meant someone was about to have a problem. And this rhythm was something in between, which was somehow worse than either. Maggie. She turned. He was standing in the middle of the floor with the look on his face that she'd categorized over 3 years as his performance face, the one he got when he wanted to make a point and wanted an audience for it. The couple in the corner, the trucker at the counter, the 5 bikers in the booth, all of them within earshot. These floors, he said. Look at these floors. She looked at the floors. They looked fine. She had swept them at 7:30, mopped them at closing prep. Start swept again after the last big table left. I see some scuff marks under table 4, he said, pointing with the kind of precision that wasn't really about scuff marks. I'll get the mop, she said. It's not just the mop, Maggie. It's the fact that we've talked about this. That you move so slow that by the time you get to things, they're already worse than they should be. He said it conversationally. That was the cruelest version of it when he said it like he was just making an observation, like it wasn't personal. I'm starting to think you're just not built for this pace. Not built for this pace. She heard what he wasn't saying. She always heard what he wasn't saying. I'll take care of the floors, she said quietly. You know, maybe... He tilted his head, and she could feel the bikers watching from their booth, and she told herself, don't look over. Don't look over, whatever you do. Maybe we should think about whether the floor position makes more sense, or a back-of-house role, since the customer-facing part seems to be an issue. The trucker at the counter set his newspaper down. The couple in the corner went still, and from the booth very quietly, there was the sound of a coffee cup being set down on a table. What kind of issue? Cole's voice. Calm, measured, like a question in a business meeting. Cliff turned, looked at Cole with the expression of a man who had just been interrupted in the middle of something important. Excuse me, you said customer-facing is an issue, Cole said. He hadn't moved from the booth. He was just sitting there with his hands around his coffee cup. I was curious what you meant, since she's the one who's been taking care of us tonight, and we haven't had a single issue. Cliff blinked. He did a recalibration. Maggie could see it the way he measured a room when it suddenly shifted. I was just having a management conversation, Cliff said, in front of your customers. The red-bearded one from the neighboring table. His voice was friendly, dangerously friendly. That's a management style, I guess. Cliff's jaw tightened. I don't think this is... How long has she worked here? Cole asked. The question landed strange. Not aggressive, just interested. Cliff looked at Maggie, almost reflexively, like he was asking her to confirm something she hadn't agreed to. She said nothing. 3 years, said the trucker at the counter without looking up from his newspaper. His voice was like gravel. Give or take, I've been coming here since before she started. Cole nodded slowly. He looked at Cliff. 3 years of customer-facing, he said. No issues that I can see from where I'm sitting. Cliff's face did something complicated. He looked at the room, the trucker, the couple, the 5 very large men in the booth. And he did what people like Cliff always do when they've miscalculated the audience. He retreated. "Just get the mop, Maggie," he said, and walked back toward the office. The door closed. The room exhaled. Maggie stood very still for a moment. Then she went to the utility closet and got the mop. Her hands were shaking, not from fear, not exactly, but from the effort of containing something that had never had anywhere to go. She didn't thank Cole when she passed the table. She almost did. She had the words lined up in her throat. But something stopped her. Some old careful instinct that said, "Don't attach to this. Don't expect this to be something it isn't. People are kind for a minute, and then they leave. That's what happens." And so she just walked past with the mop and did the floors, and kept her face as neutral as she could manage. But she noticed from the corner of her eye that Cole watched her for a moment as she passed, and that his expression was not satisfied the way a man's expression is when he's done a good deed and knows it. His expression was something different. It was troubled, like he was working something out. At 10:15, the couple left. The trucker paid his bill and tucked $3 under his saucer. He always did. $3 had for years. She could have told you the precise weight of a $3 tip from memory. The cafe was nearly empty. Just the bikers. Maggie was stacking menus at the counter when the one Cole called Ricky, she'd caught the name partway through the evening, came up to refill his own coffee because he'd noticed she was busy. Nobody did that. In 3 years of waitressing, she could count on one hand the number of times a customer had picked up a coffee pot to help themselves in order to save her steps. "Good stew," he said, pouring. "You really make it." "The base, yeah. The broth's mine. Cliff would serve store-bought if he could get away with it." She hadn't meant to say that. It was the kind of observation she kept to herself, filed away in the internal commentary she ran constantly, but never spoke aloud. Ricky just nodded like it confirmed something. "Recipe's yours, though. You should remember that." She didn't know how to answer, so she didn't, and he took his coffee back to the table, like they'd just talked about the weather. Pasa. It was 10:40 when she found the notebook. She was clearing the booth next to the biker's table, the one that Cliff had decided should be kept set up, even though no one had sat there in 2 hours, because Cliff operated under the theory that seeing empty but prepared tables made a restaurant look ready rather than slow, and she saw it under the neighboring chair. Small, spiral-bound, red cover worn soft at the corners. She picked it up, looked at the table of bikers currently deep in their own conversation. "Excuse me," she said, holding it up. "Did one of you drop this?" Cole looked at it, then at the table. Then he reached back to the inside pocket of his cut, that jacket she'd learned was called a cut, and came up empty. "Yeah," he said. "That's mine." She walked over and held it out to him. He took it, but he didn't immediately put it back in his pocket. He held it for a second, looking at the cover, and then he looked up at her with an expression she hadn't seen on him yet. Something slightly surprised and more open than the careful neutrality he'd been wearing all evening. "You dropped something this important," the red-bearded one said, nodding at the notebook. "And you don't even notice. Must be having a night." Cole's eyes were still on Maggie. "What time do you close?" he asked. 11, she said. "All right." He tucked the notebook back. "We'll be out by then." She nodded, went back to her closing work. It was 11:14 when they finally got up to leave. Cliff had technically closed at 11, but made no move to hurry the remaining customers because he'd learned that rushing bikers was its own kind of structural problem. Maggie was wiping down the last section of tables when Cole stopped beside her on the way to the door. "Maggie." She looked up. He held out the ticket from their table. She'd already rung them up at the register. She'd seen one of the others handle it while she was in the kitchen, so she wasn't sure what he was holding. Then she saw the additional cash tucked beneath it. "That's too much," she said immediately. "That's what the stew was worth," he said. She shook her head. "Sir, really? Cole." "Cole." She paused. "It's too much. Then put it towards something you're saving for," he said, and something in his voice was so completely matter-of-fact, so entirely free of performance, that it stopped her cold. She looked at him. He looked back. "I don't know what you mean," she said, but she did. She did know what she meant, and somehow impossibly, she suspected he might too. He held her gaze for one more second. "Yeah, you do," he said quietly. And then he walked out the door. Yet, she stood there for a moment after the sound of the engine started up and pulled away. Then she looked at the money in her hand. She counted it twice. It was enough, almost exactly enough, to bring her total to $10,260. She stood very still in the middle of the empty cafe, under the fluorescent lights, with a dish rag in one hand and more hope than she knew what to do with in the other. And for the first time in longer than she could remember, the system didn't feel like the only option available. She almost missed the notebook. It was on the floor near the booth. It must have fallen again when Cole stood up, and she nearly kicked it without looking. She picked it up, started to set it aside for him to claim if he came back. And then she would never be fully able to explain why she did what she did next, except that something about this night had made her feel for a few short hours like someone who was allowed to be curious. She opened it to a random page. Oh, the first page she landed on was a list. Not a grocery list, not a schedule, not anything ordinary. It was a list titled in plain handwriting, "Businesses under Terrence Holdings, Labor Complaints 2019 to 2023. Rusty Wheel Café was the third line down. There were 12 entries total. She read them without fully breathing. And by the time she'd reached the last line, by the time she'd understood slowly, and then all at once what she was holding, the notebook was trembling in her hands. Not from fear. From the first fragile sense that someone had already started doing something about the thing she'd been trying to survive alone for 3 years. And that she was not, as it turned out, as invisible as she'd been told. She closed the notebook. She put it carefully in her apron pocket, and she finished closing the cafe alone the same as every night, except that nothing, not a single thing was the same. She didn't sleep that night. She lay on top of her covers with the notebook on her chest and stared at the ceiling and listened to the sound of a truck passing on the highway 2 blocks away, and she tried to make sense of what she was holding. Not the physical object that was simple enough, spiral-bound red cover, 40 or so pages, but the weight of it, the implications of it. The fact that a man she had known for approximately 2.5 hours had apparently been building a case against the place where she worked, against the man who had been making her small for 3 years. She opened it again at 1 a.m, sitting up in bed with the lamp on. She read it more carefully this time, slow and methodical, the way she read recipes, paying attention not just to the ingredients, but to the sequence, the logic, the reason each element was there. The list of businesses under Terrence Holdings was 1 page. Cole had filled 3 pages of notes underneath it in handwriting that was smaller than she expected. Careful, compact, the handwriting of someone who had learned to put a lot of information into a limited space. Names, dates, dollar amounts. Next to the Rusty Wheel Café entry, he had written 4 things. Wage shortfall, confirm with payroll records. Tip, pooling illegal arrangement. Health violations. 20, 21, 20, 22, dismissed. Talk to M. Talk to M. She stared at that for a long time. Talk to M. She didn't know whether M was her. She told herself it probably wasn't. There were plenty of names that started with M. The cook's wife was named Martha. The woman who did Friday breakfast prep was named Marlene. It didn't have to be her. It probably wasn't her. But at 2 a.m, alone in her apartment with the notebook in her lap, she knew in the way you sometimes just know things that it was. She put the notebook in her nightstand drawer. She turned off the lamp. She lay in the dark and thought about what it meant that someone had noticed. Really noticed, not with pity, but with purpose, what was happening at Rusty Wheel Café. And somewhere around 3 a.m, between one thought and the next, she fell asleep without meaning to. She dreamed about cooking. She almost always did. Saturday morning at the cafe started the way Saturday mornings always did, loud and fast, and slightly chaotic. The way a place gets when the weekend crowd comes in with expectations the weekday regulars never bother forming. Maggie was on the floor by 7, coffee in hand, working the breakfast rush with the focused efficiency of someone who had been doing this long enough that her body knew the job even when her mind was somewhere else entirely. And her mind was somewhere else entirely. She watched Cliff more carefully than usual. Not obviously she'd learned years ago that obvious watching made people defensive, and defensive people were dangerous. But with the peripheral awareness she'd developed, the same way animals develop it, as a survival tool. She noticed the way he managed the register, the way the tip jar that sat on the counter, the one customers dropped cash into all morning, somehow always had less in it by noon than it should have. The way Gerald never asked about it, and the new girl Patrice who'd been working 3 weeks just assumed that was how it worked, because nobody had ever told Patrice otherwise. Maggie had noticed all of this before, of course. She had noticed it for years. But noticing and doing something about it were two entirely different calculations, and until last night, she hadn't had any reason to believe the second calculation was even possible. Now she was doing math she hadn't allowed herself to do before. She was still doing it at 9:15, when the door opened, and Cole Hunter walked in alone. She saw him before he saw her. He came through the door the same way he'd done everything the night before, without hurry, without performance, with the settled quality of a man who had decided exactly what he was doing and didn't need to announce it. He looked around the room once, found her, sat down at the counter, which was where she was working, and picked up a menu he clearly didn't need. She walked over. "Morning," she said. Neutral. Careful. She was very good at neutral and careful. "Morning?" He set the menu down. "Coffee, please." She poured it, set it in front of him. He wrapped both hands around the cup the way he had the night before, and she had the distinct impression he used coffee less as a beverage and more as something to do with his hands while he thought. "You forgot something," she said. She reached into her apron pocket and put the notebook on the counter between them. He looked at it, then at her. Something moved across his face, not surprise exactly, but a recalibration. An adjustment of whatever he'd been planning to say. "How much of it did you read?" he asked. "Enough to know that you didn't end up here by accident." He picked up the notebook slowly, turned it over in his hands, set it down again without putting it away. "No," he said. "I didn't. So what is it you actually want, Cole? Because you don't seem like someone who drives out to a roadside cafe to eat stew and mind his own business." Something that might have been the beginning of a smile crossed his face and then disappeared. The stew really was good. "That's not an answer." "No," he agreed. "It's not." He drank some coffee. She waited. She had learned that waiting was often more effective than asking if you could make yourself comfortable enough in the silence. "You know a woman named Sandra Reyes?" he finally said. The name landed somewhere old in Maggie's memory. "She used to work here, 2 years ago, maybe 2.5. She left suddenly." A pause. "Cliff said she quit." "We all knew she didn't quit." "She didn't quit," Cole confirmed. "She was pushed out because she started asking questions about her paychecks, questions that had good answers, just not the ones Cliff wanted her to hear." He looked at Maggie steadily. "Sandra's my cousin. I've been looking into this place for 8 months." Maggie went very still. 8 months, she repeated. "Long enough to find a pattern." He opened the notebook to a page near the middle and turned it so she could see it from her side of the counter. "These are the wage discrepancies for Rusty Wheel going back 30 months. The difference between what employees should have been paid under Oklahoma minimum wage law adjusted for tip credit rules and what they were actually paid." He ran his finger down the column of numbers. "It adds up, Maggie." She looked at the numbers. She looked at them until they stopped being abstract and started being real. Started being the extra shifts she'd worked that showed up short on her check. The tip pool deductions that were never explained. The hours that somehow came in under 40. no matter how many she actually clocked. "How much?" she asked. "For you specifically, over 30 months. He turned to another page. "Somewhere between $4,000 and $5,000. I'm still working the exact number. $4,000 to $5,000. She gripped the edge of the counter. Not dramatically. Just steadily, the way you grip something when you need to make sure the ground is still there. "That would have been," she said slowly, "most of what I still need." He didn't ask what she needed it for. He just nodded. Like he already knew, or like it didn't matter. What mattered was that she'd needed it, and it had been taken. "What are you going to do with all this?" she asked. "That depends," he said, "on how many people are willing to talk." The breakfast rush was still going. She had 3 other tables. She had coffee to refill and a ticket to run, and Cliff was going to notice if she stood at the counter too long. She knew all of this, and none of it felt as real as this conversation. "I have to work," she said. "I know. I can't. I'm not sure I can do what you're asking." "I'm not asking you anything yet," he said. "I'm just telling you what I know. What you do with it is yours." She looked at him for a moment. Then she picked up the coffee pot and went to check on table 3. But she came back. Of course she came back. It took her 4 trips to the counter. 4 trips disguised as refills, as changing out the sugar caddy, as wiping down the section near where he sat, to get through everything he was willing to tell her in that setting. And what he told her piece by piece was this. Terrence Holdings, the parent company that owned Rusty Wheel Café, and several other small businesses in and around the Tulsa metro area, had been under informal scrutiny from the Department of Labor for nearly a year. Nothing official yet. No charges filed. But a complaint had been submitted by Sandra Reyes, as it turned out with help from a labor attorney Cole had found for her, and the complaint was being reviewed. What was missing, the attorney had told Cole, was corroborating testimony. Witnesses. People who had worked under Cliff Mercer and experienced the same patterns Sandra had documented. "How many people have you talked to?" Maggie asked on the 3rd trip. 3 former employees, Cole said. "All willing to go on record, all scared." He paused. "Fear makes people hesitate. And when people hesitate, cases stall." "You think I'm not scared?" He looked at her directly. "I think you're one of the least scared people I've ever watched deal with something genuinely frightening," he said. "What you're doing, enduring that day after day and still functioning, still staying kind, that's not the behavior of someone who's beaten. That's someone who's holding on for a reason." She didn't answer right away. Not because she didn't have something to say, but because the something she had to say was too large and too fragile to say quickly. "Culinary school," she finally said on the 4th trip. "That's the reason, in case you were wondering." He nodded, like that was exactly what he'd expected, and like it mattered. "Then let's make sure you get there," he said. He left 45 minutes later. He left a reasonable tip, not extravagant, nothing that would draw attention, and he looked at her once more on the way to the door and said very quietly, "We'll be back tonight. All of us, if that's all right." "It's a public restaurant," she said. "It is," he agreed. And he left. She watched the door close and stood there for a moment in the middle of the Saturday rush, plates going out, coffee going cold at table 6. Cliff's voice coming through the kitchen window. About something she couldn't quite make out, and she felt it again. That thing she'd felt the night before. That thing that didn't have a word yet. It was getting stronger, more specific. It was starting to feel less like hope and more like resolve. Those were different things. Hope was fragile. Resolve had edges. Cliff noticed the bikers when they pulled in that evening. Of course he did. Cliff noticed everything that came through his door, and he had a particular antenna for anything that required managing, which was how he thought about people, as things that required managing. And 5 large men on motorcycles who had been in his cafe the night before, and were now back again, settling into the same booth, ordering the same coffee, that was something that required managing. He came out of the office at 7:30 and stood at the end of the counter watching. Maggie felt him watching. She felt everything in this building. She'd developed a kind of sonar for it. That hyper-awareness you build when your environment has been unpredictable long enough that your nervous system decides to just run the scan constantly. She went to the biker's table. She took their order. She was professional and pleasant and entirely unremarkable, which was the performance she needed to give right now, and she was good at performances. "How are you tonight?" Cole asked when she brought the coffee. "Fine," she said, then quieter. "He noticed you're back." "Good," said the red-bearded one, Ricky. He said it with a pleasantness that did not match the word. "Don't start something," Maggie said automatically. "We never start anything," said a third man, the one they called Pete, who had been quieter than the others and had a quality of watchfulness that reminded Maggie slightly of Cole. "We finish things." She looked at him. She looked at all of them. "Whatever you're doing," she said carefully, "do it quietly. Please. I can't lose this job yet." Cole nodded. "Understood." She walked away. But she felt for the first time in 3 years that she wasn't walking away alone. What happened next was both remarkable and invisible. Over the next 2 hours, while Maggie worked her tables and Cliff hovered and the cafe moved through its Saturday night rhythm, Cole's crew did something that looked to anyone watching like nothing at all. Ricky had a quiet conversation with Gerald the cook out by the back door during a smoke break. Not about anything specific, just talking about the job, about the hours, about how a man gets through a long week. Gerald, who Maggie had always assumed was Cliff's ally, because he laughed at Cliff's jokes, started talking about things he'd never said out loud before. How he hadn't seen a raise in 18 months. How the delivery receipts Cliff asked him to sign off on didn't always match what actually came through the back door. Pete sat at the counter and over 3 cups of coffee managed to have what appeared to be a casual conversation with Patrice, the new girl who was too new to be guarded, and who it turned out had already noticed enough in 3 weeks to fill a page of its own. And Cole himself said very little to anyone. He sat in the booth and drank his coffee and watched. But every so often, he made a small note in a different notebook, a plain 1 gray cover that he'd produced from a different pocket. And Maggie caught the motion from across the room and felt something she could only describe as gravitational. Like the room was subtly rearranging itself around a center of gravity she hadn't been aware of before. At 8:55, Cliff walked the floor. He did this sometimes, a patrol really dressed up as management. He'd stop at tables, make small talk, check on things that didn't need checking. It was about visibility. About reminding everyone, customers included, that this was his place and he ran it the way he wanted to run it. He stopped near the biker's booth. "Everything all right over here?" he said in the voice he reserved for customers he was slightly wary of. Friendly enough to be plausible, distant enough to be safe. "Perfect," Cole said. He smiled, and it was interesting that smile Maggie thought watching from the far side of the room. It reached his eyes just enough to be believable, and stopped just short of warmth. "Good, good." Cliff glanced at the table. The gray notebook was nowhere visible. "You boys passing through, or—" "We like the food," Ricky said pleasantly. "You've got a good thing here with the stew." Cliff's chest expanded slightly. Pride was his most reliable weakness, and everyone who'd known him more than a week had figured that out. "Yeah, we've been working on the menu, trying to build something solid." "Maggie makes the stew?" Cole asked. Casual. Conversational. Cliff's expression shifted, just fractionally. "She helps with prep." "She said the recipe's hers," Pete said from the counter, not turning around. Silence. It wasn't a long silence. Maybe 3 seconds, but it had texture. "Well," Cliff said, "recipes in a commercial kitchen are—" "Whose name is on the payroll for recipe development?" Cole asked. Still pleasant, still easy. Like he was genuinely curious and had no idea that the question had a shape like a blade. Cliff looked at him for a moment. Then he did the thing that people do when they want to exit a conversation without appearing to flee. He laughed briefly and touched the back of a chair and said, "Let me know if you need anything." and walked away. Maggie, who had been holding her breath without realizing it, exhaled slowly. She caught Cole's eye across the room. He gave her the smallest possible nod. Gerald found her at the walk-in at 9:20. She was counting produce end-of-week inventory, a job that Cliff had assigned to her 6 months ago, and then promptly forgotten he'd assigned to her. So she just kept doing it because someone had to, and because she liked the quiet of the walk-in, the cold air that didn't care about anything she was worried about. She heard the door and looked up. Gerald was a big man, wide and soft in the way of people who eat what they cook, which she had always privately liked about him, that unself-consciousness. And he had the expression of someone who had been working up to something for a while and had finally gotten close enough to the edge to jump. "Those guys out there," he said, "the bikers. What about them?" "One of them was asking me things." He paused. "Smart things. Things I didn't know how to answer without—" Another pause. "Maggie, the payroll." "What about it?" "You know how he does the payroll." She kept her face neutral. "Cliff does payroll." "Cliff does payroll in a way that I'm pretty sure isn't right," Gerald said, and he said it with the weight of a man admitting something he's been pretending not to know for a long time. "I signed a document last April that I didn't fully read, and I've been thinking about it since, and I think—" He stopped. "I think I signed off on something I shouldn't have signed off on." Maggie looked at him steadily. "Why are you telling me this?" "Because you've been here longer than anyone," Gerald said. "And because that biker's cousin, or whoever she was, Sandra, she used to talk to you. I remember that. You were her friend here." "I was her coworker." "You were her friend," Gerald insisted. "And she left because she found out what he was doing, and nobody did anything about it. And His jaw worked. "I should have done something about it." Maggie looked at the produce clipboard in her hands. Then she looked at Gerald, and she made a decision. Not the dramatic kind, not the kind that comes with a soundtrack, just a quiet, internal, shifting a gear catching. "Go back out and finish your shift," she said. "Don't say anything to Cliff. Don't change anything. Just if that man at the booth comes and talks to you again, tell him the truth." Gerald blinked. "That's it." "That's it," she said. "Sometimes that's enough." He nodded. He left. And Maggie stood alone in the cold walk-in for one more moment because she needed a breath of air that wasn't complicated, and then she went back to work. The twist came at 11. The cafe was closing. The last customers gone, Patrice sweeping the far section, and Gerald doing his end-of-night kitchen run. The bikers were still at their table. They had a way of being the last ones out that had started feeling less like coincidence and more like intention. Cole came to the counter. Maggie was counting the register. Cliff was in the back office with the door mostly closed, doing whatever Cliff did at end of night with receipts and cash that she had never been invited to observe. "We found something," Cole said quietly enough that his voice didn't carry. She didn't stop counting. "What kind of something?" "Last month's payroll records. Someone got careless with a printout. It was in the recycling out back. Ricky found it when he went to his bike." She looked up. "The recycling." "It's not inside the building," he said. "Fair game." His voice was calm, but there was something underneath it, that troubled quality she'd noticed the night before, except now it wasn't general. It was specific. "Maggie, he's been filing your hours as part-time, on paper, for at least the past year." She stared at him. "You've been working full-time hours," Cole continued. 55 hours some weeks, according to what you told me this morning. He's filing you as 28 to 32. Below the threshold for benefits. Below the overtime threshold. "I know I don't get benefits," she said slowly. "He told me when I started that—" "He told you what he needed you to believe," Cole said. "The law doesn't work the way he told you it works. And the money he's saved by filing you wrong over a year, Maggie, is not a small number." She set down the bills in her hand. Her system, the careful, controlled eyes-down system she had been running for 3 years, 2 months and 18 days, cracked down the middle. Not loudly, not dramatically. Just a clean, quiet fracture, the kind that happens when something has been under too much pressure for too long and finally reaches the precise angle of failure. "How many people?" she asked. Her voice was steady. She was proud of that. "At least 4 employees currently, more historically." "Can you prove it?" "With the right attorney." He held her gaze. "Yes." She reached under the counter for her bag. She pulled out a folded piece of paper, the note she'd been keeping, the running total. The one that said $10,260 in her handwriting. The number that represented everything she'd saved. Every sacrifice, every humiliation absorbed in service of a future she'd been building $1 at a time. She put it on the counter between them. "How long does something like this take?" she asked. "Months, maybe. Longer if they fight it. But you've done this before." It wasn't a question. He answered it anyway. "Yes. And Sandra, your cousin. How is she now?" Something shifted in his face. Genuine this time. Not managed. "She's good," he said. "She's better. It took a while, but she's better." Maggie looked at the number on the paper. Then she folded it back up and put it in her pocket. "All right," she said. Just that. All right. 2 words that cost her everything she'd built her safety on and gave her back something she hadn't had in years. She couldn't have named it yet. It was too new. Cole picked up the gray notebook from the seat beside him and opened it to a fresh page. "Tell me what you know," he said. And Maggie Carter, who had been saying nothing for 3 years, 2 months, and 18 days, took a breath and started talking. In the back office behind the mostly closed door, Cliff Mercer was doing his end-of-night count. Humming something tuneless to himself, completely unaware that the woman he had been making small for 3 years was at this exact moment becoming someone he would spend a very long time wishing he had never underestimated. Outside, 4 motorcycles sat quiet in the parking lot, and one more had its engine running, ready whenever she was to help carry what she'd found out of the dark and into the open. She talked for 47 minutes. She knew that because the clock above the register was the kind with a second hand that moved in precise visible ticks, and she watched it without meaning to, the way you watch something fixed when everything else is moving too fast. 47 minutes. In that time, Cliff turned off his office light and left through the back without looking at the floor. Patrice finished sweeping and clocked out. Gerald did the same. And Maggie stood at the counter with Cole Hunter and told him things she had never said out loud to anyone. The paycheck discrepancies she'd noticed, but couldn't prove. The tip jar that Cliff emptied every Thursday night after close, always with some explanation that almost made sense if you didn't look at it too hard. The expired produce she'd found in the walk-in 3 times in the past year moved to the front with the labels turned. The morning 2 summers ago, when a health inspector had come in unannounced, and Cliff had somehow known he was coming, and the kitchen had been conspicuously spotless. And afterward, Cliff had been on the phone with someone for a long time in his office with the door locked. She told him about Sandra Reyes. What Sandra had actually said before she left, not the version Cliff circulated where Sandra had quit over a scheduling dispute, but the real version, the one Sandra had whispered to Maggie in the walk-in the morning before she disappeared, shaking and pale. "He's stealing from us, Maggie. Not a little, a lot. And he knows I know." Cole listened without interrupting. He wrote in the gray notebook, and he listened, and when she finished he was quiet for a moment, and then he said, "Why didn't you leave when Sandra did?" It was a fair question. It didn't feel like an accusation, which was why she answered it honestly. "Because I was close," she said, "to the number. And I didn't know where else to go that would let me keep getting close." She paused. "And because I was scared that if I walked out angry, he'd make sure I couldn't work anywhere in this county. He knows people. He talks." "He does," Cole agreed. "That's actually in here." He touched the notebook. 3 former employees who couldn't get references. 2 who said they were given bad ones. She closed her eyes briefly, then opened them. "What happens now?" "Now I make some calls," he said. "The attorney who's been working Sandra's case needs to know what you've told me tonight, and some of this." He held up the printout from the recycling the payroll sheet. "This goes to the Department of Labor contact we've been working with. How long before anything actually happens? Honestly, I don't know. Could be weeks, could be longer." He looked at her directly. "But Maggie, this kind of thing doesn't usually go quietly. When it moves fast." She nodded. She picked up her bag. She looked around the empty cafe, the chairs on the tables, the coffee maker cooling down the sign in the window that said "open" on one side and "closed" on the other. And it occurred to her that she had been looking at that sign for 3 years and never once thought about which side was more true. "Don't change anything," Cole said. "Don't act differently. Don't let him know anything's shifted." "Can you do that?" "I've been acting like everything's fine for 3 years," she said. "I think I can manage a few more weeks." He almost smiled. "Yeah," he said. "I think you can too." She walked out into the parking lot. Behind her, she heard the door lock. Ahead of her, the 4 bikes were still there, and the men who rode them were leaning against them in the particular easy way of people who are used to waiting. One of them, Pete, lifted his chin at her as she passed. She nodded back. She drove home. She counted her money. $10,260, same as last night, same as it would be tomorrow. And she put it back in the tin box, and she lay down. And this time, she slept immediately, and hard, like a person who has finally put something down that she'd been carrying too long. 3 weeks passed. From the outside, nothing changed. The cafe opened at 6:30. Maggie mopped the floors. The coffee burned, and the breakfast crowd came and went. And Cliff managed and insulted and performed, and Danny laughed at things that weren't funny, and Gerald cooked without talking, and Patrice learned the rhythms of a place that was teaching her the wrong things without knowing it. But underneath all of that, things were moving. Cole came back every few days, never on a schedule that would be predictable. Sometimes alone, sometimes with 1 or 2 of the others. He always sat at the counter or in the booth, always ordered coffee and something from the menu, always tipped exactly right enough to be respectful, not enough to draw attention. And every time he found a moment. A brief window. Cliff in the back, Patrice on break. The floor quiet enough to talk without being heard. The attorney filed a formal information request with the Department of Labor Monday. He told her on a Tuesday morning, voice low, both of them looking straight ahead. They have 30 days to respond. What does that mean in plain language? It means the clock is running. On a Thursday, he told her that 2 more former employees had agreed to speak with the attorney on record. One of them has pay stubs going back 2 years, physical copies. He kept everything. He said it with the satisfaction of someone who knew exactly how much that mattered. On a Saturday afternoon, quieter than usual between the lunch rush and dinner, Ricky sat at the counter while Maggie restocked the condiment station, and he talked without looking at her, which was their system, when Cliff was moving around unpredictably. "Gerald's talking," he said. "Really talking. He remembered the name of the produce supplier who's been getting cash payments off the books. That's a tax issue on top of everything else." Maggie kept her hands moving on the condiment bottles. "Gerald's a good man," she said with something that surprised her. She realized she meant it. "He just got used to looking away." "Most people do," Ricky said. "Doesn't make them bad, just makes them people." She thought about that for a long time after he left. What surprised her most in those 3 weeks was how much lighter she felt. And that confused her at first because nothing was better yet. The situation was the same. Cliff was the same. The floors were the same floors, and the coffee was the same. Burned coffee, and the tip jar was still being quietly emptied every Thursday. Nothing had actually changed, except that she knew it was changing. And knowing was different from hoping in the same way that resolve was different from hope. She moved through her shifts with something she hadn't carried in a long time. A quiet, functional certainty that the ground under her was temporary. That she was passing through, not planted here. It showed in small ways. She stood a little straighter. Not noticeably, she was careful about that. Careful not to let Cliff sense anything different about her, because Cliff, for all his cruelty, had a predator's instinct for shifts in the room. But the other staff noticed. Patrice said to her one afternoon, "You seem different lately." And when Maggie asked how Patrice thought about it and said, "Like you stopped apologizing, not out loud, just in general." Maggie hadn't known she'd been apologizing in general. But she thought about it later and decided Patrice was right, and that it had happened without her choosing it, which was the best kind of change, the kind that doesn't come from deciding to be different, but from the world finally confirming what you'd known about yourself all along and been too worn down to hold on to. Gerald started leaving little notes. Nothing incriminating, just post-its on the pass-through window. The stew base you prepped Monday was better than the usual, whatever you changed. Or customer at table 2 asked specifically if the soup was homemade. Told him it was. He left 20%. Small things. But they were acknowledgments, and acknowledgments from Gerald, who had never acknowledged anything in 3 years, meant something had shifted in him too. Even Danny dialed it back. Whether it was the presence of the bikers on their rotating appearances, or something else, he couldn't name. His comments grew shorter, and then less frequent, and then for the most part, stopped. He still wasn't someone Maggie would have trusted with anything important. But silence from someone who had been loud at her expense was its own form of progress. The folder arrived on a Wednesday. Cole brought it without ceremony. Just walked in at 9 in the morning, sat down at the counter, and when Maggie came over with the coffee, he set it on the counter between them. Not the gray notebook. Something new, a manila envelope, thick, the kind with the metal clasp that you press flat to open. He held it down with one hand. "Don't open it here," he said. "Read it tonight at home. And then there's a phone number on the top sheet. Attorney's name is Patricia Solis. She wants to talk to you directly if you're willing." What's in it? Everything we've built so far. All of it: wage records, testimony, the payroll printout, health inspection history, the tax issue with the produce supplier. He paused. "And something else. Something we found this week that I want you to be prepared for." She looked at the envelope. "Tell me." He glanced once at the kitchen window. Gerald wasn't visible. The door to Cliff's office was closed, which usually meant he was on the phone. "Cliff's been writing your hours as a part-time contractor for 2 tax years," Cole said. "Not just internally, externally. To the IRS. Which means the misclassification isn't just a labor violation. It potentially exposes him to federal tax fraud." Maggie stared at the envelope. "Federal," she said. "Federal," he confirmed. "Patricia wanted you to know before you talk to her, because it changes the landscape of what happens next, and she thinks you deserve to make an informed decision about whether you want to be part of this." "Do the others know the other employees?" "Being notified this week." She put her hand flat on the envelope. It was warm from his hold. "And if I say yes, if I talk to Patricia, then you become part of a formal complaint. Your name goes on record. It becomes real." "It's already real," she said quietly. He looked at her for a moment. "Yeah," he said. "It is." She slid the envelope off the counter and into her bag, smooth and quick, the practiced motion of someone who had been managing small acts of concealment in this building for a long time. "I'll call her tonight," she said. She poured his coffee and went back to work, and if her hands shook slightly for the next 20 minutes, she kept them below counter level where no one could see. Patricia Solis was nothing like what Maggie had imagined. She had expected she didn't know exactly what she had expected. Someone harder, maybe. Someone with the polished, slightly remote quality of attorneys she'd seen on television. People who talked about cases the way accountants talked about numbers accurately, but without warmth. What she got instead was a woman who answered the phone on the second ring at 8:45 at night and opened the conversation with, "Maggie Carter, I've been wanting to talk to you for 3 weeks. Cole said you wanted my account directly," Maggie said. "I do. But first I want to say something, and I want you to hear it before we get into any of the formal stuff." A pause. "What's been done to you is wrong. Not in a complicated legal way, in a plain human way. And I'm sorry you've been carrying it alone." Maggie sat on her bed with the manila envelope open in her lap and the phone against her ear, and she didn't say anything for a moment because her throat had done something unexpected. "Thank you," she finally managed. "All right," Patricia said, and her voice shifted, still warm, but focused, now efficient. "Let's talk about what we're going to do about it." They talked for an hour and 20 minutes. Patricia walked her through the complaint structure, what Maggie's testimony would cover, what documentation she still needed. She explained the federal angle carefully and without sensationalism. Yes, it was serious. Yes, it was significant. But the goal was not to frighten anyone. The goal was to build something airtight. "I need you to understand," Patricia said near the end, "that when this goes, it will go publicly. There's no version of this that stays quiet. Are you prepared for that? What does publicly mean? Media, potentially. Definitely visible within the local community. Your name, your account, your face possibly if you choose to speak to press, which is entirely your decision." A pause. "I want you to think about that. Not because I think you shouldn't do it, but because it changes things for you personally, and you should choose with your eyes open." "What happened to the other people who came forward, Sandra? The others?" "Sandra is doing well. She found a different job 3 months after she filed. She's been harassed online in the way that people who take on employers sometimes are. She handled it." Another pause. "She's a tough woman." "She always was," Maggie said. "The others, there's variation. Some have had it easier. One had a hard few months. But Maggie," Patricia's voice was direct, "none of them regret it. Not one. I've done this long enough to know that the people who regret it are the ones who don't come forward." Maggie looked at the tin box on her nightstand. $1,060. 3 years, 2 months of her life distilled into a number. "What about the wages?" she said. "The money he owes me, the back wages. If the complaint succeeds, and I believe it will, the Department of Labor can order full back pay for all affected employees plus penalties. Your share based on what Cole's given me would be substantial. A beat. Possibly more than what you've saved." Maggie closed her eyes. "I'm in," she said. "Tell me what you need." 2 more weeks. That was how long it took for the pieces to come together. For Patricia to file the expanded complaint. For the Department of Labor to open a formal investigation quietly, without Cliff's knowledge. For Cole's crew to make their final round of evidence collection, Gerald's signed statement. Patrice's account, the former employee's documentation, the payroll printout, the produce supplier's name, cross-referenced against Cliff's tax filings. 2 weeks of Maggie going to work every day and mopping floors and serving coffee and absorbing Cliff's commentary and keeping her face neutral and her eyes down. 2 weeks of the system for the last time. She didn't know it would be the last time. Not exactly. But she could feel it the way you feel a storm before it arrives, a pressure in the air, an electricity that doesn't have a source yet. Cole came in on a Thursday night, and for the first time since this began, he didn't have a notebook out. He just sat at the counter and drank his coffee and looked at her in a way that was different from usual, more direct, more present, like someone who had finished calculating and was now just being there. "Patricia filed yesterday," he said. Maggie's hands went still on the counter. "The formal investigation opens Monday," he said. "Cliff will receive notification next week. It might be by mail. It might be in person. But one way or another, he'll know." "And then what?" "And then he'll either cooperate or fight it. And if he fights it..." Cole set down his cup. "That's when the public piece starts." "Are you and your crew still going to be around?" she asked. She hadn't meant to ask it. It came out before she could decide not to. It sounded, she thought immediately, like something more than a strategic question, and she wasn't sure she was comfortable with that. But Cole answered it straightforwardly, which was his way. "Yes," he said. "We'll be around." She nodded. "Okay, Maggie." He waited until she looked at him. "Whatever happens next, whatever he does when he finds out you don't have to handle it the way you've been handling everything. You understand what I'm saying? You mean I don't have to go quiet?" "I mean, you don't have to go quiet." She looked at him for a long moment, and then she said, "That's going to take some practice." "You've got time," he said. And this time he did smile fully without holding it back, and it changed his face entirely, made him look younger and less careful, and she looked away, because looking at it was confusing, and she had enough to manage at the moment. The breaking point came on a Saturday. It was packed, the kind of Saturday the cafe got 3 or 4 times a year when something was happening in town that drove traffic their way. A car show 2 exits down. Every booth full, the counter full, a line at the door, Cliff moving between tables with his best performance smile because a crowded room brought out his better instincts for theater. He liked an audience. He always had. He just couldn't always control who else the audience ended up watching. Cole and all 5 of his crew were in the back booth. They'd been there since 6, and it was nearly 8 now, and nobody on staff had commented on it because the bikers had over the past 5 weeks become something close to fixtures. Gerald brought them coffee without being asked. Patrice had started chatting with Ricky about her community college classes. Maggie was moving fast the way she moved when the floor was full, efficient, focused, aware of everything, without looking directly at any of it. She had 3 tables turning over at once, a ticket she needed to run a refill for the couple at 4, and a tray of food for the large group at 7 that she'd been building for the past 8 minutes. She picked up the tray. It was heavy. She knew it was heavy. She'd assessed it before she lifted it. She always did, years of practice, and she'd balanced it the way she'd learned to balance things, with her weight distributed and her grip sure, and her path planned out 3 steps in advance. What she hadn't planned on was Danny. He came through the swinging kitchen door at the exact wrong moment, moving fast without looking, and the door caught the edge of her tray, not enough to knock it, but enough to throw off the balance, and she compensated hard, and the tray lurched and 2 plates slid before she caught the recovery, and one of them, just one, went over the edge and hit the floor. 1 plate. 1. The cafe went briefly quiet, the way cafes do when something loud happens unexpectedly. Then the noise resumed. It was a plate. These things happened. Maggie crouched down, picked up the pieces, set the tray safely on the nearest flat surface. Her heart was hammering, not from the drop, but from the knowledge of what was coming. Because Cliff had been watching. She could feel it. She could always feel it. He crossed the room in 12 steps. She counted them. Maggie. His voice was at performance pitch, that particular register he used when the room was full, and he wanted to make sure the room knew he was in charge. What is happening over here? A plate slipped, she said carefully. Danny came through the door. I don't need a story, Cliff said. I need you to explain to me how someone who's been working this floor for 3 years still can't manage a full tray without making a scene. It wasn't her fault, said Danny from the kitchen doorway. And it was so unexpected from Danny, of all people, Danny who had spent 6 weeks making her the punchline, that Maggie looked up at him in surprise. Cliff didn't look at Danny. He was looking at the room, looking at the audience. Nobody wants to watch this, he said to Maggie, flat and carrying. You understand that nobody comes here to watch you drop things and make a mess. It's bad for business. A pause, and then the thing that undid him. The thing that had always been waiting to undo him all the years he'd been doing this, and just hadn't met the right room yet. Maybe you belong in the back where the customers don't have to look at you. The cafe went quiet. Not the brief quiet of a dropped plate. The other kind. The kind with weight. And from the back booth there was the sound of 5 chairs moving at once. Cole stood up first. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't make any aggressive motion. He simply stood, which in a packed cafe where everyone had just gone silent was enough. Ricky stood beside him a half-second later, then Pete. Then the other 2, whose names Maggie had finally learned in the past weeks, Jay and Marcus, stood without a word. 5 men, standing, in a room full of people who were now watching something that was not what they had come here for and would not be able to stop watching. Cliff turned. He looked at Cole. He looked at the 5 of them. And something happened on his face that Maggie had never seen there before, because Cliff had spent 20 years making sure it never showed the precise expression of a man who has just realized that the room has turned, and that he doesn't know when it turned, and that he doesn't know how to turn it back. Cole walked to the counter. He reached under his jacket and put something on the counter in front of Cliff. A folder, thick, the kind with a rubber band around it which was the only thing holding together the weight of everything inside it. The cafe was so quiet that Maggie could hear the rubber band when Cole slid it off. Wage theft, Cole said. Going back 30 months, documented. He placed the first sheet on the counter. Illegal tip pooling arrangement. Another sheet. Tax misclassification of 4 employees reported to the IRS. Another. Health inspection violations in 2021 and 2022, dismissed through an inspector who's currently under a separate investigation. Another. Witness statements from 7 current and former employees. Each sheet went down like a verdict. Cliff's face had done something complicated and was still doing it. "What is this?" he said. His voice had lost the performance register. It was just his voice, lower and less certain than the room was used to hearing. This, Cole said, is what happens when you make people feel like they don't exist. They start paying very close attention to you. Someone at table 4 had their phone out. Then someone else. Then the couple by the window. "You've been stealing from the people who made this place work." Cole continued, and his voice was still calm, still even, still measured, which somehow made it worse than shouting would have been. "Every week, for years, from people who needed every dollar you took." Cliff looked at Maggie. It was a strange look. Not angry, not defiant. Those came later in the legal proceedings, when he'd had time to reconstruct himself. What she saw on his face in that moment was something rawer than either of those. It was the look of a man who is seeing for the first time that the person he made small had been very quietly becoming something he couldn't manage. "Maggie," he started. "Don't," she said, "just that. Quiet, entirely steady." The door opened. 2 people came in, not customers. The badges told the room what they were before anyone had to say it. Patrice made a sound behind her. Gerald leaned out the kitchen window and then leaned back in. Danny stood very still in the doorway holding a dish towel and for once said absolutely nothing. Cole stepped back from the counter. He looked at Maggie across the width of the room, across the full cafe of people with their phones out, and their breath held across 3 years of floors she'd mopped and coffee she'd burned, and humiliations she'd absorbed in service of a future that had just become several steps closer. He nodded once. She nodded back, and then she watched quietly with her hands still and her face composed as the room that had been Cliff Mercer's stage for 2 decades became in the space of a single Saturday night, the place where his story ended. The cafe was never the same after that Saturday night. Not structurally, it still opened at 6:30 the following Monday, because Cliff's manager, a forgettable man named Brad, who had worked for Terrence Holdings for 11 years and kept his head reliably below every parapet, unlocked the door and turned on the coffee maker, and pretended that the world had not rearranged itself 48 hours earlier. But something had broken in the walls, in the air, in the particular quality of silence that a place holds when the person who used to fill it with cruelty is suddenly gone. It wasn't peaceful exactly. It was more like the specific absence of a noise you'd gotten so used to you didn't know it was there until it stopped. Maggie came in at 6:15. Early, same as always. She mopped the floors, same as always. She set up the coffee station, refilled the napkin dispensers, checked the walk-in, ran through the morning checklist she'd been running for 3 years without being asked to, and without being thanked for. Gerald came in at 6:40 and looked at her across the kitchen pass-through, and didn't say anything for a long moment. "You okay?" he finally asked. "Yes," she said. And then, because it was the truth, and she was tired of managing the truth into smaller shapes. "Actually, yeah, I think I am." He nodded. He went to work. She went to work. And the morning happened around them the way mornings do, ordinary and relentless and indifferent to the fact that everything underneath it had completely changed. The videos went up that same Monday morning. She didn't know how many people had been recording on Saturday night. She'd seen phones out, but hadn't counted. Hadn't thought about what it would mean, but it turned out to be enough. Enough to piece together the whole sequence. Cole laying the documents on the counter one by one, his voice clear and steady in the cafe's silence. Cliff's face doing the things it did as the room closed in around him. Maggie saying don't with her hands still and her voice flat and quiet. The badges at the door. The first video had 40,000 views by noon. By the time Maggie's shift ended at 3, it had 200,000. Her phone, a 4-year-old Android she'd been meaning to replace since it cracked, started doing something it had never done before, which was receiving calls from numbers she didn't recognize. She didn't answer them. She sat in her car in the parking lot and watched the notifications come in and felt a specific kind of vertigo. The vertigo of a person who has spent years being invisible, discovering that visibility is not in fact what they imagined it would feel like. She called Cole. He picked up on the second ring. "You've seen it," she said. "I've seen it. It's a lot. It's going to get louder before it quiets down," he said. "Patricia warned me this might happen. She wants to talk to you about how to handle press." "I don't know how to handle press. Nobody does the first time." A pause. "Maggie, this is good. This is how these things work. Public attention is what makes institutions respond. The more people who see what happened to you, the harder it is for Terrence Holdings to slow-walk the investigation." She looked at her cracked phone screen. "There are people in the comments calling me brave," she said. "I don't feel brave. I feel like I'm going to throw up." He made a sound that wasn't quite a laugh but was close to it. "Those things aren't mutually exclusive," he said. She almost smiled. "I'm going to go home and not answer my phone." "That's fine," he said. "Just don't disappear. We have more work to do." She drove home. She didn't answer her phone. She sat at her kitchen table and ate cereal for dinner and watched the comment count on the videos climb past 500,000. And she let herself feel all the things she'd been too careful to feel for 3 years. The anger, the grief, the exhaustion of sustained invisibility, and underneath all of it, so new it barely had a shape. Yet something that felt like the possibility of being genuinely proud of herself. She sat with that feeling for a long time. It was unfamiliar and awkward, like a piece of furniture in the wrong room. She didn't know what to do with it yet. But she didn't push it away either. That, she thought, was progress. Rusty Wheel Café closed its doors 9 days later. Brad, the manager, sent a group text to all staff on a Wednesday morning at 7:15. Cafe closed effective immediately pending investigation. Payroll will be processed as required by law. Contact HR at the number below. No explanation beyond that. No apology. No acknowledgement of the 3, 5, 10 years people had spent building their lives around those shifts. Maggie read the text, standing in her kitchen with her second cup of coffee. She read it twice. Then she put her phone down and looked at the window and felt the thing that comes after 3 years of surviving a place and then watching it end. Not triumph exactly, because triumph implies you wanted a fight, and she had never wanted a fight. She had just wanted to cook and to save her money and to leave on her own terms. She called Patrice first. Patrice, who had been there 3 weeks and had barely unpacked herself into the job, answered with the thin voice of someone who has been awake for too long worrying about something she can't control. "What do I do, Maggie? I have rent in 2 weeks." "I know," Maggie said. "Listen to me. Patricia Solis, the attorney on the case, she's already filed for interim wage protection for all current employees. You're covered through the end of the pay period while the investigation runs. Call her office today, okay? Her number is in the folder I'm going to text you." "You have her number." "I have her number," Maggie said. "I have a lot of things I didn't have 3 weeks ago." She called Gerald next. He was quieter. Gerald processed things slowly, which she had decided was a sign of seriousness rather than slowness. "I've been cooking at this place for 6 years, he said. There was no anger in it, just the flat, careful acknowledgement of a fact. "You're a good cook, Gerald." "I know I am," he said simply. "I just didn't always act like it mattered." "It mattered," she said. "It always mattered." She even called Danny. She hadn't planned to. She'd started with Patrice and Gerald, and then sat for a moment with her phone in her hand and thought about what Cole had said about people who look away, not being bad, just being people. And then she dialed. Danny answered with a voice that was younger than she usually thought of him, stripped of the performance, the jokes, the constant positioning. Maggie. Hey, He stopped, started again. I'm sorry for the stuff I said. All of it. I don't have a good reason. No, she agreed. You don't. Silence. But you backed me up that night, she said. When it counted, I remember that. I told the truth, he said. That's all. Sometimes that's the hardest thing, she said. You're going to be okay, Danny. Find something better. You're young enough that this can be a lesson instead of a pattern. She hung up and sat for a moment in the quiet of her apartment, surrounded by a silence that felt for the first time in a long time, like space rather than emptiness. The investigation moved with a speed that surprised even Patricia Solis. She said so directly in the call she had with Maggie and Cole together the following Friday. I've been doing this for 14 years, she said, and I've never seen the Department of Labor move this fast on a wage theft case. The federal component accelerated everything. And the public attention, she paused. Let's say they didn't want to be on the wrong side of the story. What happens to Cliff? Maggie asked. Criminal referral is likely. The tax misclassification alone is significant. He'll have his day in court. Patricia's voice was measured, careful. Maggie, I need to tell you something, and I want you to hear it without getting overwhelmed. Tell me. The back wage calculation for all current and former employees came back from the DOL's preliminary review this morning. A pause. Your individual share 32 months of wage theft, including overtime tip pool violations, and the misclassification penalty offset is $19,400. Maggie didn't say anything. Maggie. I heard you, she said. Her voice had gone somewhere very quiet and very still. That number may adjust slightly as the review completes, but it's unlikely to go down. More likely to go up. Cole, who had been listening without speaking, said, You okay? $19,400, Maggie said slowly, like she was translating a language she'd just learned. That's... She stopped. Did the math she didn't need to do because she already knew the numbers by heart. Her savings $10,260. The culinary school tuition $14,200. What she still needed $3,940. What she was about to receive nearly 5 times that. I'm going to culinary school, she said. It wasn't a question. It wasn't even a decision. It had already been a decision for 3 years. But saying it out loud now with this number attached to it made it something different. Made it real, in the way that only happens when the obstacle that's been standing between you and a thing is suddenly, irreversibly removed. Yes, Patricia said. You are. And more. Cole said quietly from his side of the call. She didn't ask what he meant. Not yet. But the word landed and stayed. The first news story ran the following Tuesday. Local Tulsa station. Nothing major, a 5-minute segment on the 6 o'clock news, using footage from the cafe videos, combined with a brief on-camera interview with Patricia and a quote from Sandra Reyes, who had agreed to speak publicly. Maggie wasn't in it by her own choice. She wasn't ready yet. She needed to understand the thing that was happening before she could talk about it. But then the regional paper picked it up. Then a national outlet ran a short piece under the headline, Oklahoma Waitress becomes center of federal wage theft investigation after viral video. Then someone shared it in a Facebook group for restaurant workers, and then a woman's advocacy account with 3 million followers posted it with the caption, She survived it every day and still stayed kind. That's leadership. That last sentence was from Sandra's interview. Patricia had said it first to Cole in the parking lot of Rusty Wheel the night everything happened, and Sandra had heard it and remembered it, and now it was everywhere. Maggie's phone rang for 4 days straight. She answered most of it eventually. Not the media, not yet, but the messages from people she didn't know. Women mostly. Some men, people who'd worked in kitchens and restaurants and offices and warehouses, and who wrote things like, "I worked for someone like that for 7 years, and I never knew I could do anything about it. And you made me feel like I wasn't crazy, and I showed this to my daughter because I wanted her to see what it looks like when someone doesn't give up." She read every one. She didn't respond to all of them. There were too many, but she read them, and each one left something behind, a small deposit of something she couldn't quantify, but could feel accumulating. That time, Cole came to her apartment for the first time 3 weeks after the cafe closed. He knocked, she opened the door, and he was standing there with 2 cups of takeout coffee and an expression that was slightly less guarded than his usual, which on his face was roughly the equivalent of anyone else walking in with their heart on their sleeve. She let him in. He sat at her kitchen table. She sat across from him. "I have something to ask you," he said. "Ask." He wrapped his hands around the coffee cup, same as always. And she thought she had thought this before, and kept redirecting herself away from it, and redirecting herself back, that there was something deeply consistent about Cole Hunter. He was the same person at 8 in the morning on a Tuesday as he had been that first Friday night when he'd walked into a failing diner and quietly started paying attention. That consistency was, she had decided, one of the most attractive qualities a person could have, and she was choosing not to think about that right now. "There's a building," he said, "outside of town, about 4 miles past the old grain elevator on Route 9. Used to be a steakhouse, closed 3 years ago when the owner retired. Full commercial kitchen dining room that seats about 60. Owner's been trying to sell it for 2 years and not finding the right buyer." Maggie set down her coffee. "Cole, let me finish," he said. "The club has money in a fund we use for community projects. Has for years. It's something we started after Sandra's situation, actually. A way to do something with what we find instead of just exposing it and walking away." He paused. "The building is affordable. With the fund and with some additional contributions from people in the club who want to be part of this, specifically, we can buy it, we can renovate it, we can open it." She stared at him. And then, he said, "We would like very much to offer you a partnership stake in it. Majority stake. Your name, your menu, your rules." The kitchen was very quiet. "That's insane," she said. "Probably." He agreed without any particular concern. "I don't have restaurant experience. I have waitress experience. I've never managed a staff. I've never dealt with a liquor license or a lease or a vendor relationship or a..." "You've been running the operational side of Rusty Wheel for 3 years without being paid to," Cole said. "You know what vendors Cliff used and which ones were reliable. You've done inventory. You've managed prep schedules. You know how a restaurant runs from the inside." He paused. "And you have a culinary school seat waiting for you." "I was going to start in the fall. The building won't be ready until December at the earliest. You can do both." He held her gaze. "Maggie, I've seen a lot of situations like yours. I've helped where I could and moved on. This is the first time I've sat across from someone and thought this person isn't just surviving a bad situation. This person has a vision, and if they get the chance to build it, it's going to be something real." Her throat did the thing it had been doing too often lately. She looked at the table. "Why are you doing this?" she asked. "Really? Not the official reason, the real one." He was quiet for a moment. "Because Sandra lost 2 years of her life to a man like Cliff," he said. "And because I spent those 2 years being angry about it and not knowing what to do with the anger. And then I walked into that cafe and I watched you and I thought..." He stopped, started again. "I thought, here is someone who kept her kindness. After everything, she kept it. And that is a rarer thing than any business plan I've ever seen." She looked up at him. He was looking at her directly, and his face was doing the open thing it did when he stopped managing it, and it was the most honest expression she'd seen from him in 5 weeks of watching him be honest about everything else. "This is terrifying," she said. "Yes," he said. "What if I fail?" "Then you'll have tried something real," he said, "which is more than most people do." A pause. "But you won't fail." "You can't know that." "I know you stayed kind," he said. "That's the hardest part. Everything else is logistics." She sat with it. really sat with it, didn't rush past the fear or the disbelief or the specific vulnerability of being offered something you've wanted so long that actually receiving it feels like a trap. She let all of that be there, and she stayed in the seat, and she looked at the man across from her, and she thought about everything she'd learned in 5 weeks about what it meant to be seen by someone who actually looked. "I want to read any agreement before I sign anything," she said. "Patricia will draft it," he said immediately. "You'll have full review. I want to be involved in the renovation decisions. Obviously. And I want—" She stopped. "I want to hire people that other places won't hire. People who've been passed over. Single parents. People coming back from hard things." She looked at him steadily. "That's not optional. That's what the place is for." "That," Cole said, "is exactly what the place is for." She picked up her coffee. She drank some. She looked out the kitchen window at the street she'd lived on for 4 years and thought about what it might feel like to look out a different window and see something she'd built. "Okay," she said. He nodded. He didn't make a big thing of it. No handshake, no celebration. Just a nod, which was his way. Like the decision had been right all along, and the only question was when she'd arrive at it. "When do we see the building?" she said. "Tomorrow if you want." "Tomorrow," she said. She cried in the car afterward. Not during, not in front of him. Not then. She drove for 6 minutes, and then she pulled into the parking lot of a grocery store and put the car in park, and sat there and cried in the honest, specific way that she hadn't let herself cry in years. Not from sadness, though grief was in it. The grief of all the time she'd spent making herself small, and all the money that had been taken, and all the Saturday mornings she'd stood at that sink with cold water running over her wrists, waiting to feel okay again. All of that was in it. But mostly, what she was crying from was relief. The specific, overwhelming relief of a person who has been carrying something very heavy for a very long time, and has finally been given permission to set it down. She sat there until it was finished. Then she found a napkin in the glove compartment, and she cleaned up her face, and she drove home. And that night, for the first time in 3 years, she opened the recipe notebook she'd been keeping since she was 22. The one filled with comfort food ideas and menu sketches, and the emotional note on the first page that said a place where nobody feels ashamed to exist. And she started reading it, not like a wish, but like a plan. The building on Route 9 was more than she expected. She walked through it the next morning with Cole and a contractor from the club named Victor, who knew commercial kitchens the way some people know languages fluently and with obvious affection. The dining room was bigger than she'd imagined from Cole's description, and the kitchen was old, but solid, built for volume, with the bones of something that had worked hard for years and hadn't been mistreated. She ran her hand along the prep counter and felt the particular quality of a surface that had seen real cooking. "How much work?" she asked Victor. 6 weeks if we push, he said. 8 if we do it right. "Do it right," she said immediately. Victor grinned. "I like her," he told Cole. Cole looked at Maggie with that expression she was getting to know, the one that was satisfaction without performance warmth, without theater. "Yeah," he said. "Me too." She stood in the middle of the dining room, 60 seats, worn floors, light coming through windows that needed cleaning, and she let herself imagine it. Not perfectly, not completely, but enough. Tables with actual flowers on them. A menu written in her handwriting. People sitting here who had been told by other places that they were too much, too difficult, too complicated, sitting here and eating well and feeling for the duration of a meal, at least like they belonged somewhere. "I want a sign," she said out loud, mostly to herself. "What kind of sign?" Cole asked. She thought about it. She thought about 3 years of floors and burned coffee and the tin box under her mattress and Sandra whispering in the walk-in, and the moment she'd said, "Don't," and meant it. She thought about Patrice saying you stopped apologizing and Gerald's post-its on the pass-through window and the way 47 minutes of telling the truth had changed more than 3 years of silence. "Something about what this place is for," she said, in plain language, "so nobody has to guess when they walk in." Cole said nothing. He just waited the way he always waited, with the patience of someone who understood that the right words came in their own time. She found them 3 days later at 2 in the morning in the kitchen of her apartment, working on the stew recipe she was going to put on the menu. She wrote them on a piece of paper and sent them to Cole without explanation. He responded 4 minutes later, which told her he was also awake at 2 in the morning, which told her something with a single word. Perfect. The words she'd written were, "People grow best where they are not humiliated." That was the sign. That was what it was for. And for the first time in a very long time, Maggie Carter felt like she was exactly where she was supposed to be. Not there yet, not finished, not arrived, but moving. Clearly and deliberately, and without apology, moving. The restaurant opened on a Thursday, not a Friday, not a Saturday, not the days you pick when you want a crowd. Maggie had chosen Thursday deliberately, specifically, the way she made every decision now, with intention. Thursday was the day she'd first counted past $9,000 in that tin box. Thursday was the day Patricia Solis had called to confirm the back-wage settlement. Thursday was a working day, an ordinary day, a day that belonged to people who showed up even when nobody was watching. She got there at 4 in the morning. She needed 2 hours alone in that kitchen before anyone else arrived. Not to prep Victor, and the crew had done the final walkthrough the night before, and the walk-in was stocked, and the line was set up exactly the way she'd drawn it on paper 3 weeks ago in her apartment at midnight. She didn't need 2 hours to prepare the kitchen. She needed 2 hours to prepare herself. She stood at the prep counter, and she breathed. She looked at the equipment that was now hers, or hers in partnership, hers in the way that the deed and the agreement and Patricia's careful legal architecture had made real, and she let the reality of it arrive without rushing it. This counter, this stove, these 60 seats in the dining room beyond the pass-through window, her name on the door, Maggie's table. She had fought Cole on the name. Not hard. She didn't have the energy for a hard fight in the middle of everything else, but she'd said once, "Doesn't have to be my name. Could be something more neutral." And Cole had looked at her with the expression she'd learned meant he was about to be firm about something, and he'd said, "It has your name because it's yours. That's not negotiable." She'd let it go. Standing in the kitchen at 4 in the morning, she was grateful she had. Chiapuki. Gerald arrived at 6. She hadn't asked him. He had called her 2 weeks after the cafe closed while she was meeting with Victor about the kitchen renovation, and said without preamble, "I want to cook. In a place that doesn't make me feel like I'm doing something wrong by doing my job well." She had told him about the position line cook sous chef track real hours with real pay and a raise structure she and Patricia had built out carefully. He had said yes before she finished the sentence. He came through the back door at 6 and put on his apron and looked at the kitchen the way he'd looked at the cafe kitchen 6 years ago, probably when it was still new, with the respectful attention of someone who understood that kitchens were serious places. "Different," he said. "Yeah," she agreed. "Better." "Yeah." He went to the stove without another word. She went back to her station, and they worked side by side in the early morning quiet, the way they had learned to work over 3 years of shared space, without needing to explain themselves to each other, which was its own kind of fluency. Patrice arrived at 7. She'd accepted the floor manager position with a disbelief that had taken 2 weeks to soften into certainty. She walked in with the particular energy of someone who has been given a real responsibility for the first time, and is terrified of it, and determined to be worthy of it in equal measure. She straightened every table setting twice before the first customer arrived. Maggie watched her and said nothing, and felt something she recognized eventually as pride. Not the territorial kind, not the possessive kind, but the kind that comes from watching someone discover what they're capable of. Churriter. The first customer walked in at 10:58. It was Mrs. Arlene Hutchins, 73 years old, who had driven 40 minutes from her home in Broken Arrow because her granddaughter had seen the story online and sent her the link and said, "Grandma, you have to try this place." Mrs. Hutchins sat down at table 4, ordered the beef stew and the cornbread, and when Maggie came out of the kitchen to check on the floor, a habit she hadn't been able to stop herself from building in, even with Patrice managing. Mrs. Hutchins looked up and said, "Are you the one? The waitress from the video?" "I'm the chef," Maggie said. "But yes." Mrs. Hutchins reached across the table and took Maggie's hand in both of hers, which were small and warm, and had the dry grip of someone who had lived a long time doing practical things. "Good for you, sweetheart," she said, simply, without theater. "Good for you." Maggie thanked her and went back to the kitchen and stood at her station for a moment with her eyes closed and her hands flat on the counter. Good for you. She let that settle. She put it where she was keeping the things that mattered. Then she went back to cooking. Yeah, by noon every table was full. Not because of advertising, she'd spent almost nothing on advertising. Because word had spread in the way that things spread now through phones and shares, and the particular momentum of a story that touches something real in people. They came from the town, from neighboring towns, from Tulsa, from farther. Some of them had seen the video. Some of them knew someone who had. Some of them just knew in the wordless way that people know when a place is different that this was worth the drive. Cole and his crew arrived at 12:30. They didn't make an announcement. They just came in and took the large table near the back, the same spatial instinct as always, the position that allowed watching without blocking. And Patrice seated them the same as anyone else. But the room noticed. The room noticed in the way it always did when those 5 men walked into a space, the brief recalibration of atmosphere, and then something interesting happened. Instead of tension, the room relaxed. Because people who had heard the story, who understood what these men had done and why recognized them not as something to be wary of, but as something to feel safe near, Cole ordered the stew. Of course he did. When Maggie brought it out herself, she'd decided she was doing table visits for the opening Patrice could manage the floor. He looked up at her and said, "How does it feel?" She thought about it honestly. "Like the first day of something," she said, "which is terrifying, and also the only thing I've ever wanted." "Good," he said. "Hold on to both of those things. They'll keep you honest." She did something then that she hadn't quite planned. She put her hand on his shoulder briefly, the way you touch someone who has helped you carry something heavy when you finally get it through the door. He didn't make it into more than it was. He just covered her hand with his for a moment, which was enough. She went back to the kitchen. Gerald, who had seen the whole thing through the pass-through window, said nothing. But he plated the next order with particular care, which was his version of having a feeling about something. The first month was chaos, not bad chaos. The chaos of growth which has its own texture, breathless and exhausting and studded with small victories. She hired 3 more people in the second week, a woman named Rosa, who had been out of the workforce for 4 years after leaving an abusive marriage, and who turned out to be the fastest, most precise prep cook Maggie had ever watched work. A man named James, 58, who had been laid off from the oil industry and hadn't worked in 18 months, and who had hands that knew physical labor and a willingness to learn everything that Maggie needed to teach him. And a 19-year-old named Eli who reminded her uncomfortably of Danny, but who, unlike Danny, had the quality of someone who was watching everything in order to understand it rather than use it. She told each of them the same thing during their first week. "This kitchen runs on 2 rules. You do your job and you treat everyone here with respect. That's it. That's the whole list. Everything else we'll figure out together." Rosa on her 3rd day stopped Maggie after a shift and said, "I've worked in 3 kitchens. Nobody ever said that to me before." Maggie looked at her. "Said what?" "That we'd figure it out together." Rosa folded her arms across her chest in the way of someone holding something carefully. "Like it's a we." Maggie thought about that. "It's a we," she said. "That's the whole point of the place." The twist that nobody expected came on a Tuesday in October, 10 months after the opening. Maggie was in the back working on the winter menu. She revised it, seasonally, had been doing it since month 2. The seasonal rhythm of ingredients being something she'd cared about since long before she had a kitchen to express it in, when Patrice came through the kitchen door, with an expression that landed somewhere between uncertain and alarmed. "There's someone in the dining room," Patrice said. "I think you should come out." "Who?" Patrice looked at her. Just looked. Maggie understood. She wiped her hands on her apron. She walked through the kitchen door and into the dining room and stopped. Cliff Mercer was sitting alone at the small table near the window. The one she'd put there for solo diners, she'd specifically designed the layout to include tables for people eating alone, because she knew what it felt like to need a place to sit by yourself without feeling like an inconvenience. He was sitting with his hands flat on the table and a look on his face that she had never seen on him before. Not the performance face, not the management face, not the cruelty dressed up as authority, just a man. Just an ordinary, diminished older man sitting in a restaurant that used to be nothing and was now something, looking at the room around him with the expression of someone who understands finally and too late what they threw away. He had aged. She didn't know how to account for it. It had been less than a year, but the legal proceedings had done to him what 3 years at Rusty Wheel had done to her, compressed and accelerated by the weight of being held accountable. He saw her. He didn't stand up. He didn't speak. He just looked at her with those eyes that had once been the eyes of someone with power over her and were now just eyes, and in them she saw something she hadn't anticipated. Shame. Real shame. Not the performance of regret that people put on for judges and attorneys and cameras. The other kind. The private kind that arrives when there's no audience left to perform for. The dining room had noticed. The conversations had lowered. Patrice was at the host stand, not moving. Rosa had appeared in the kitchen window. Maggie walked to his table. She stood in front of him, and she felt the full weight of everything that had passed between them, 3 years of it. The floors, the tip jar, the cold water on her wrists, the words said in front of customers. The slow erosion of a person treated like furniture. She felt all of it, and she let it be there, present and real, and not minimized. And then she pulled out the chair across from him and sat down. The dining room went very quiet. "Cliff," she said. He opened his mouth. "Maggie, I don't expect." "I'm not here to forgive you," she said. Her voice was steady. "I want you to understand that. I'm not doing this for closure, or because I've become a better person than you, or because I want you to feel good about yourself. I'm doing this because this is what this place is for." He blinked. His jaw worked. "This restaurant exists," she continued, "because you spent years making people feel like they didn't deserve to take up space. And everything I've built here is the direct result of that. So in a very specific way, you are the reason this exists." She held his gaze. "I'm not grateful for that. I want to be clear. But I'm also not going to spend the rest of my life carrying what you did as if it's mine to carry. It's not. It was never mine." He was quiet for a long time. When he spoke, his voice was lower than she'd ever heard it. "I don't know why I came here." "Yes, you do," she said. "The same reason anyone comes here. You needed somewhere that wouldn't make you feel ashamed to sit down." He looked at the table, at his hands. Maggie stood up. She went to the pass-through window and came back with a bowl of beef stew and a piece of cornbread on the side. She set it in front of him without ceremony and said simply, "Nobody eats ashamed here, not even you." She walked back to the kitchen. The dining room exhaled. At the large table in the back, Cole sat very still, watching with an expression that she couldn't see from the kitchen doorway, but that Patrice, who could see it, would describe later as the look of a man witnessing something he will spend a long time thinking about. Rosa met her at the prep counter when she came back. "You okay?" she asked. "Yes," Maggie said. And she was. She was okay in the deep, unperformative way, okay in her body, in her chest, in the part of herself she'd spent 3 years protecting. That was... Rosa stopped. "I don't have a word for what that was." "Expensive," Maggie said quietly. "But worth it." She put her apron back on and went back to the winter menu and didn't think about Cliff Mercer again until much later when she was closing up, and Patrice mentioned that he'd left $40 on the table, more than twice the cost of what he'd ordered, and had walked out without speaking to anyone. She put the $40 in the employee fund she'd started for emergency shifts. That felt right. The anniversary arrived faster than she expected. 1 year, and she didn't know how to measure it. Not in months, not in covers served or menus revised or staff hired. She measured it the way she measured everything real in what had changed in people. Rosa had been promoted to lead prep. She had also, in month 7, left the apartment she'd been sharing with 4 other people and moved into her own place, the first place that was entirely hers, and she'd told Maggie about it the morning after she signed the lease, with the specific careful pride of someone not sure they were allowed to be proud yet. Maggie had told her she was absolutely allowed. James had turned out to have a talent for front-of-house management that neither of them had anticipated. He was methodical and warm, and the customers loved him in the way that customers love someone who treats them like they specifically matter. She was moving him into an assistant floor manager role in the new year. Eli had stopped reminding her of Danny after about the 2nd month, when it became clear that what he'd reminded her of was just youth. The unformed quality of someone who hadn't decided yet what kind of person he was, and that he was deciding quietly and consistently to be a good one. Gerald had started testing recipes on his days off and bringing them in on Tuesdays. Some of them were extraordinary. She'd put 3 of them on the menu with his name next to them. He had not said anything about that, but she'd caught him reading the menu twice on separate occasions slowly, at the part where it said, Chef Gerald's Roasted Poblano Soup, and that was saying something. The anniversary dinner was not something she'd planned. Or rather, she'd planned a regular dinner service slightly fuller than usual, because word had spread, and then the evening had become something else, without her organizing it. Cole and his crew came same as always, the large table in the back. But this time, they arrived earlier than usual, 5 o'clock before the dinner rush, and they weren't alone. Sandra Reyes was with them. She and Maggie had spoken on the phone twice and exchanged messages regularly. But they had not been in the same room since Sandra had worked at Rusty Wheel 2.5 years ago, and when Sandra came through the door and found Maggie at the host stand, and they stood looking at each other for a moment, the thing that passed between them was too layered to name. 2 women who had survived the same thing at different points in time, one of whom had made it possible for the other to survive differently. Sandra opened her arms, and Maggie stepped into them, and they stood there for a moment in the entrance of a restaurant that had been built out of everything that was taken from both of them. "You did it," Sandra said against her shoulder. "We did it," Maggie said. Ouch. Patricia Solis arrived at 6. She sat with Sandra and Cole and his crew, and the table was loud in a way that the rest of the restaurant seemed to calibrate around the warm noise of people who have been through something real together and are on the other side of it and know it. Maggie moved between the kitchen and the floor all evening, cooking and checking tables, and occasionally stopping at that back table for a few minutes to eat something standing up, which was how she'd been eating for a year and which everyone at the table had learned not to comment on, because she didn't stay still for long, and that was just how she was. At 8:30, Cole caught her on one of her passes. "Sit down," he said, "for 5 minutes. The kitchen can manage 5 minutes. Gerald will—" "Sit down, Maggie." She sat down, across from him. The same position they'd been in 100 times, counter-booth kitchen table, this table. And she felt the familiarity of it settle around her like something she'd been wearing long enough that it no longer felt like a choice. "How does it feel?" he asked. "Same question as opening day." "Different than I expected," she said honestly. "I thought it would feel like an ending, like a destination. But it feels—" She paused, looking for the right word. "Like something I'm in the middle of. Like I've been walking a long time, and I looked up and realized the walking is the thing, not the arriving." He looked at her with those calm, light-colored eyes that had been the first eyes in 3 years to look at her without wanting something from the looking. "That's the right feeling," he said. "Is it?" "The people who think they've arrived stop building," he said. "You're not going to stop building." She looked at him. At the table full of people who had each in their own way made this possible. at the 60 seats of a restaurant that had started as a line in a recipe notebook, a place where nobody feels ashamed to exist, and had become real actual operational alive. "Cole," she said. "Yeah, why did you really come back after the first night, when you left, and you didn't have to come back?" He was quiet for a moment. She'd asked versions of this question before, and he'd answered versions of it, the one about Sandra, the one about the pattern, the one about kindness being rare. All of those were true. She knew they were true. But she was asking for the other thing, the thing underneath all the true things. He looked at her steadily. "Because you said it's been going since this morning, and by now it's ready," he said. "About the stew. And I thought I have never in my life heard someone talk about food with that particular expression and not have it mean something much larger than food." She didn't say anything. "You were talking about your whole life," he said quietly. "How long it had been going. How ready it was. And I wanted—" He paused. "I wanted to see what it would taste like." Maggie looked at the man across the table, the man who had walked into the worst night of her life and paid attention. Who had built a case with the careful patience of someone who believed justice was worth the work? Who had offered her a partnership when the easier thing would have been to feel good about himself and drive away? Who showed up consistently and without announcement every time the distance between where she was and where she was going felt too large to cross alone? She said his name, just his name. The way you say someone's name when you've been working up to something and have finally decided to stop working up to it. He said hers back the same way. And whatever happened next between them was theirs, private and real, and not part of the story that the internet got to have. But it happened in a room she had built at a table with her name on the door, surrounded by the people who had helped her become someone worth building it for. The wooden sign went up the following week. Victor made it he'd been the one to suggest real wood, not vinyl, real carved letters that would last. He brought it on a Tuesday morning, and Maggie and Cole held it up against the wall above the entrance and looked at it for a long time before anyone said anything. People grow best where they are not humiliated. Plain letters, no flourish. The kind of thing you could read once and carry with you for the rest of the day. "It's right," Patrice said from behind them. Rosa said nothing, but she put her hand against the wall beneath it briefly, the way you touch something you want to make sure is real. Gerald came out of the kitchen, looked at it for approximately 4 seconds, nodded once, and went back to work, which from Gerald was a standing ovation. Nudge. That evening, as the dinner service wound down and the last tables finished their meals, and Patrice began the closing routine, 5 motorcycles took their places in the parking lot of Maggie's table, the way they had every night since the restaurant opened. Not because they'd been asked, not because of any arrangement or agreement, just because Cole had showed up the first night and the others had followed, and somewhere along the way, it had become the thing they did, a presence steady and unremarkable, the way that real protection usually is. A woman walking to her car at 9:30 had once stopped and asked Ricky, who was leaning against his bike with his coffee, whether they were security. He had thought about it and said, "We're just here." She'd nodded and thanked him, which had confused him slightly, and Maggie had heard the story and understood it completely. Just being there was everything. It had always been everything. The entire difference between enduring alone and surviving in the company of people who give a damn. That difference was not complicated. It was not sophisticated. It did not require a legal framework or a viral video or a federal investigation. It required 5 men who looked at a woman the world had decided not to see and decided to look. Maggie locked up the restaurant at 10:15 on the night of the anniversary. She stood at the door for a moment before she turned off the last interior light, looking at the tables, the chairs, the pass-through window where Gerald had leaned out to nod at her signs, and Rosa appeared when she sensed something important was happening, and Eli now appeared just because he was learning slowly to pay attention to things that mattered. She looked at the sign above the entrance. She looked at the parking lot where 5 bikes sat quiet in the dark. She looked at what she had built from what had been broken, and she felt cleanly, fully, without qualification, that it was good. She turned off the light. She locked the door, and Maggie Carter, who had once gripped a coffee pot and walked 30 feet toward Mockery, and found something else entirely, walked to her car, with her head up and her hands steady and her whole life ahead of her. Not despite everything that had happened, but because of it. Because of every hard and humiliating and ultimately useless attempt to make her feel like less than she was. Every one of which had failed, and would keep failing, because the woman they'd tried to diminish had turned out to be exactly the kind of person who grows tallest in the places where the ground is hardest. That was who she was. That was who she had always been. It just took a stormy Friday night, and 5 strangers, and 1 notebook, and 47 minutes of finally telling the truth for the rest of the world to find out.